Evening in the quiet suburbs of the city. The yellowish glow of streetlights bathed the small road where 14-year-old Amara was carefully pedaling her bike home after her music lesson. Amara adored her violin, and the precious instrument was safely tucked inside the backpack slung over her shoulders. She still had her headphones on, soothing classical melodies calming her soul after a long day. The street was silent, with only a few scattered pedestrians. Amara focused on every turn of her bike wheels, avoiding potholes and piles of fallen leaves on the road. But the tranquility was abruptly shattered when a police car appeared behind her, its siren letting out a brief wail that startled her. The car stopped beside Amara. A deep, authoritative voice rang out from the rolled-down window. "Stop! Get off the bike immediately!" Amara stopped, confused and unsure of what was happening. The tall, white police officer stepped out of the car. This was Richard Carter, a veteran officer with over 10 years of experience, though his face bore a tense and cold expression. "Kid, what's in your backpack? Why are you wandering around here at this hour?" Richard asked, his tone heavy with suspicion. Amara, bewildered, tried to explain. "I'm just coming home from my music lesson. My violin is in the backpack." But Richard wasn't listening. He ordered, "Hand over the backpack. I need to check." Reluctantly, Amara removed her backpack. When she opened it, there was only her violin, a sheet music book, and a few personal items. Richard's suspicious gaze scrutinized each item nonetheless. "Do you know this area has frequent burglaries? I have every reason to suspect you," he said, his tone accusatory. Amara began to tremble. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just going home." "Silence. I didn't ask for your opinion," Richard barked, making Amara step back, her eyes welling with tears. At this point, a few passers-by stopped to watch. A young woman quickly pulled out her phone to record the scene. Richard realized he was being observed but still tried to maintain control. He grabbed Amara's arm roughly, pushing her against the police car to search her. Amara cried out, "You're hurting me. I haven't done anything wrong." Her cries seemed to fall on deaf ears. In Richard's eyes, Amara wasn't just an ordinary girl. She was a potential suspect, solely because of the color of her skin. The next morning, a video of the incident went viral on social media. The footage of young Amara being treated harshly by the police ignited outrage among thousands of viewers. Across social platforms, the hashtag Justice for Amara began trending, accompanied by comments condemning Richard's actions and the broader police system. At home, Amara sat on the sofa, her hands still trembling as she clung to her mother. Her mother, Sophia Williams, watched the video repeatedly, her face a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Sophia, a well-known congresswoman and a fierce advocate for human rights, now found her fight had become deeply personal. "My love, you did nothing wrong," Sophia said, her voice shaking as she tried to hold back tears. "But Mom, they looked at me like I was a criminal," Amara replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. She couldn't understand why this had happened to her. She was just a student, a girl who loved music. Why did she have to endure such humiliation? Sophia stood up, picking up her phone to call her team of aides. "We're not letting this go unanswered. I want this entire incident investigated transparently. We will get justice for her." The police department quickly issued a brief statement. "The incident involving Officer Richard Carter is under investigation. We urge the public not to rush to judgment." However, the statement did little to quell the growing outrage. Citizens organized protests outside police headquarters, demanding Richard's dismissal and a transparent investigation. The media relentlessly covered the story, featuring interviews with human rights activists and eyewitnesses from the scene. Sophia attended a press conference. Standing beside Amara, she spoke with a powerful and resolute voice. "My daughter, Amara, did not deserve to be treated like a criminal simply because of the color of her skin. This is not an isolated incident. It is a clear reflection of the deep-seated racism within the system. We will not remain silent." Meanwhile, Richard began to feel the weight of the backlash. He was temporarily suspended from duty, but his colleagues defended him, insisting he was just doing his job. Amara tried to return to her normal life, but the images and feelings from that night continued to haunt her. She was afraid to leave the house, scared of the stares of strangers. Even in her sleep, Amara had nightmares of Richard chasing her, his cold and judgmental gaze piercing through her. Sophia realized her daughter was deeply traumatized. She decided to take Amara to see a psychologist to help her work through her fears. "You don't have to feel ashamed or guilty," Sophia said as she accompanied Amara to her first session. "You did nothing wrong. The fault lies with them, not with you." Meanwhile, Sophia continued digging deeper into the police system. She discovered that this wasn't the first time Richard had been accused. Several similar incidents had been swept under the rug in the past. This revelation only strengthened her resolve to bring the truth to light. In his small apartment, Richard Carter sat silently in front of the TV. The news kept replaying the video he tried to ignore, but it only made his guilt grow stronger. The image of him grabbing Amara's arm, her terrified eyes, and the shouting of bystanders, all of it swirled relentlessly in his mind. Richard's phone had been ringing nonstop since morning. Colleagues called, some to offer support, but most to criticize him for bringing trouble to the force. A call from his superior ordered him to stay silent and not say anything to the press. He sighed and opened a can of beer, wondering how things had come to this. In his mind, he tried to justify his actions, convincing himself he was just doing his job and that Amara could have been a suspect. But another part of his conscience began to waver. Were his actions truly about duty, or were they driven by unconscious biases he refused to acknowledge? Richard opened his inbox. There were dozens of emails, some from people supporting him, but the majority were filled with criticism and threats. One email from his ex-wife caught his attention. "Richard, our daughter is growing up in this world. How would you feel if it were her in Amara's place? Take a hard look at yourself." He closed his laptop, feeling as though the world was collapsing around him. Meanwhile, at the police department, senior officers were holding an emergency meeting. The internal investigation into Richard was underway, but it was clear it was only a formality. Their real goal wasn't to uncover the truth, but to minimize the damage to the department's reputation. "The situation out there is bad," one senior officer said, his voice filled with concern. "But we can't let one video destroy the entire force. Carter is one of ours. We have to protect him." Outside the police department, Sophia was working with a team of lawyers and human rights activists to prepare a lawsuit. They knew the internal investigation wouldn't lead to a fair outcome, so they decided to take the case to court. A group of journalists had gathered in the area, ready to report on the developments. Sophia stood firm. She addressed the press. "We don't trust the transparency of the internal investigation. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the entire system. If we don't seek justice for Amara, who will be the next victim?" Inside the department, a few younger officers were visibly uneasy. They disagreed with how the system was covering up misconduct but were too afraid to speak out, fearing for their jobs. One of them, a young officer named Elena Martinez, quietly decided to provide information to Sophia's team. On a sleepless night, Richard found himself sifting through memories of his childhood. He had grown up in a small town where racism was normalized. His parents often told him, "Black people are lazy and dangerous." Richard remembered the first time he met a black boy at school. The boy's name was Marcus, and they had played together. But when Richard's father found out, he was furious, forbidding him from playing with Marcus and spewing hateful remarks. Richard, just a boy at the time, had silently obeyed. Those lessons had taken root, becoming an unconscious part of his mindset. As he grew older and joined the police force, Richard carried those biases with him, though he never openly acknowledged them. Staring into the mirror, Richard asked himself, "How did I become this person?" But the answer wasn't easy to find. The community's outrage grew stronger. Larger protests emerged, drawing support from human rights organizations, artists, and celebrities. Peaceful marches were held nationwide with a unifying message: justice for Amara, equality for all. Amara was invited to participate in a televised interview. Though still frightened, she decided to share her story with encouragement from her mother. During the program, the host asked, "Amara, what hurt you the most about this incident?" Amara hesitated, her eyes welling with tears. "I'm just a student. I didn't do anything wrong. But they treated me like a criminal. I don't understand why they saw me differently just because of my skin color." Her words struck a chord with millions of viewers. After the interview, social media flooded with messages of support for Amara. Many began sharing their own stories of discrimination, turning the incident into a larger movement. Richard watched the interview as well. Seeing young Amara with her tear-streaked face filled him with overwhelming guilt. But he still didn't know how to make things right. Public pressure eventually led to Richard's official suspension. Within the police department, he became the subject of gossip. Some colleagues turned their backs on him, viewing him as a scapegoat. Yet deep down, Richard knew he deserved it. At the police department, in a closed meeting room, a group of extremist officers who shared Richard's views began plotting. They weren't just angry about the media tarnishing the honor of the police force. They also saw Sophia Williams as an enemy that needed to be silenced. "Think about it," an older officer said, his tone defiant. "If she wins this case, we'll lose our authority. Precedent will be set. And soon, everyone will see us as the villains." A younger officer suggested, "We need to pressure Sophia to back down. If she doesn't, then make sure she's silenced. Permanently." Outside, Sophia and Amara were unaware that they were being targeted. Over the past few days, Sophia had been receiving threatening phone calls from unknown numbers. The callers warned her to stop before things go too far, and hinted that something terrible could happen to her and her daughter. Sophia maintained a calm demeanor in front of Amara, but deep down, she was concerned. She decided to enhance security around their home and hired a personal bodyguard. Still, these threats didn't shake her resolve. Sophia held a major press conference, publicly addressing the threats she was facing. "These threats will not silence me," Sophia declared in front of the cameras. "We are fighting for justice not just for Amara but for everyone who has been oppressed by this system. If we back down now, change will never come." The press conference further fueled public outrage. People not only demanded justice for Amara but also called for an investigation into the entire local police department. The wave of protests grew stronger and more intense. In an unexpected move, Richard Carter reached out to Sophia, requesting a private meeting. Sophia hesitated at first but eventually agreed, hoping Richard might offer a sincere apology and help advance the cause of justice. The meeting took place at a small cafe, with both parties accompanied by their lawyers. Richard arrived looking more haggard than the last time Sophia had seen him in the video. He sat across from her, avoiding direct eye contact. "Mrs. Williams," Richard began, his voice low and tense. "I never meant to hurt your daughter. I was just doing my job." Sophia interrupted, her gaze sharp. "Doing your job? Was your job to attack and humiliate a young girl because of your prejudice?" Richard fell silent, unable to respond. He clenched his hands tightly, struggling to find the words to defend himself. But every time he tried to speak, the images of Amara from the video stopped him. "You don't understand the pain you've caused," Sophia said, her voice breaking slightly. "My daughter can't sleep. She's afraid to go outside. And she's questioning whether she deserved to be treated like that. No child should ever have to endure that." Richard wanted to say something, anything, but instead, he stood up and walked away. He lacked the courage to face the truth. The conversation ended in failure, leaving Sophia frustrated and angry. Yet, she refused to let Richard's silence deter her. Sophia knew the fight for justice was far from over. Richard returned to the police department the next day. only to realize he was no longer welcome. Colleagues he once considered friends now avoided him, and some even openly criticized him. "Carter, you've disgraced us," one officer said bluntly. "Now the rest of us are being labeled as racists because of you." Richard tried to remain calm, but deep down, he felt betrayed. "I'm not the only one who's ever done something like this," he retorted. "Why am I the only one paying the price now?" The colleague scoffed. "Exactly, but you're the one who got caught. And now, you're the scapegoat." Richard realized the system he had loyally served no longer had any intention of protecting him. Their only priority was covering up the truth and preserving the police department's reputation. Worse, Richard discovered that some of his colleagues were plotting to retaliate against Sophia and her family. He felt torn. Should he continue to protect these people, or finally stand up against the injustice? Sophia decided to take the case to court. She assembled a team of top lawyers, including experts in human rights and racial discrimination within the justice system. They built a strong case, incorporating evidence from the video, witness testimonies, and Richard's personal record, including previous reports of misconduct. Amara chose to testify, even though she was still afraid. "I want to tell the truth, Mom," she said, her eyes filled with determination. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else." On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. The defense, comprising Richard and representatives from the police department, attempted to justify his actions, claiming he was merely acting on instinct. However, the video evidence and Amara's testimony completely dismantled their argument. Amara took the stand, recounting her experience with a voice that trembled but carried strength. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said. "I just wanted to go home, but they treated me like a criminal. Why should I have to live in fear just because of my skin color?" Her words left the courtroom in stunned silence. Many, including some members of the jury, were moved to tears. Media outlets outside provided continuous coverage, turning the trial into a nationwide focal point. Richard, seated at the defendant's table, felt an unfamiliar ache rising in his chest. For the first time, he fully understood the depth of the harm he had caused. But was it too late to make amends? Richard sat in his small apartment, the dim light casting shadows over his weary face. For weeks, the trial and the relentless pressure from society had pushed him to his limits. The sleepless nights were taking their toll, leaving him drained. He knew the truth could not remain hidden forever, and that realization left him feeling hollow. One morning, Richard decided to meet with his lawyer and requested to make a confession. He understood this would damage his chances of winning the case. But deep down, he could no longer bear living a lie. At the court session that day, Richard stood up, his face tense and his voice trembling. "I'm sorry," he began. "I want to admit that my actions that night were not just a mistake in judgment, but the result of deep-seated biases I've carried for years." The courtroom fell silent. Those present were stunned by Richard's unexpected confession. Amara sat beside her mother, listening intently. Sophia held her daughter's hand tightly, her expression a mix of surprise and anger. Richard continued, "I allowed prejudices I wasn't even aware of to dictate my actions. I didn't see Amara as a person that night, but as a symbol of fear and bias instilled in me since childhood. I was wrong, and I'm ready to accept responsibility." Richard's confession sent shockwaves through the public. Many were outraged, accusing him of trying to salvage his image. But others began to see him differently, as someone attempting to confront his mistakes and seek accountability. After the trial, Amara became the center of attention. She was invited to participate in workshops, television programs, and social campaigns against racial discrimination. Initially hesitant, Amara decided, with her mother's encouragement, to use her story to inspire change. At a speaking event at her school, Amara stood before hundreds of students, teachers, and parents. She wore a simple white dress, but her eyes radiated strength. "Some people might think I'm just a child," That my story doesn't matter. Amara began, her voice soft but filled with emotion. But I want to tell you this. Anyone can be a victim of prejudice, and anyone can stand up against it. Amara recounted the terrifying night when Richard assaulted her. She didn't shy away from describing the fear and pain she had endured, but she also emphasized how the experience had taught her resilience. As a black girl, there were times when I felt I wasn't valued in the eyes of some people, but my mother taught me that I am worthy, that my skin color is a beautiful part of who I am. And today, I stand here to tell you that we must not remain silent in the face of injustice. When Amara finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. She not only inspired the young people in the room but also challenged the adults to reflect on their own responsibility in creating a fairer world. The trial reached its conclusion after weeks of deliberation. The prosecution presented a compelling case, not only focusing on Richard's actions but also highlighting systemic issues within the police force. Richard's confession, while sincere, was not enough to fully mitigate his culpability. On sentencing day, both Sophia and Amara were present. The courtroom was packed, with journalists and human rights activists in attendance. The judge, an older black woman, looked directly at Richard as she delivered the verdict. "Mr. Richard Carter, this court finds that you gravely violated the human rights of Miss Amara Williams. Your actions not only caused personal harm but also undermined public trust in the justice system. Therefore, the court sentences you to 2 years in prison and mandates your participation in a rehabilitation and education program on anti-racism." Sophia felt a part of the burden lift. While the sentence couldn't erase the pain her daughter had endured, it sent a powerful message. Justice would hold wrongdoing accountable, no matter who the perpetrator was. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered in anticipation. When Sophia and Amara emerged, they were met with applause and words of encouragement. Sophia smiled, wrapped her arms around Amara, and said, "You did it. We did it." Though justice had been served, Amara still faced deep emotional scars. She often dreamed of being stopped by the police, Richard's shouts echoing in her mind. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the eyes of strangers watching her, and sometimes she wondered if they thought she was a criminal. Sophia decided to take Amara to regular therapy sessions. Through many conversations, Amara began learning how to confront her fears. She was encouraged to keep a journal to express her feelings and rediscover her joy in music. One day, Amara decided to perform her violin at a charity concert organized by her mother. Standing on the stage, the spotlight shining on her face, she felt nervous but also determined. As she played the first notes, Amara experienced the freedom and peace that music brought her. The concert ended with prolonged applause. Amara bowed to the audience, feeling as though she had overcome a significant part of her pain. Sophia, watching from backstage, wiped away tears. She knew Amara's journey was far from over, but this moment marked a significant step forward. Silently, she promised herself to continue fighting so that no child would ever have to endure what Amara had gone through. As time passed, though the scars from the incident remained, Amara began to find the strength to move forward. With the help of her mother and therapists, she slowly learned to face her fears and overcome her trauma. Amara returned to school, where her friends and teachers welcomed her with open arms. One day, during a social studies class, Amara's teacher, Mrs. Peterson, assigned an essay on the topic of justice and injustice. Amara sat quietly before the blank page, old emotions welling up inside her. But this time, instead of avoiding them, she decided to pour everything out. In her essay, Amara wrote, "Injustice doesn't just come from wrongdoing. It also comes from the silence of those who can do what's right. I used to feel like I didn't have a voice, but now I realize my voice has the power to create change. And I will never stay silent again." Amara's essay resonated deeply within the school. Mrs. Peterson asked for Amara's permission to read it aloud to the class. When she finished, the entire class stood up and applauded, and a few students even shed tears. Inspired, A group of students proposed forming an anti-racism club, electing Amara as its president. Meanwhile, Sophia continued her work in Congress. Drawing from Amara's experience, she introduced a bill to reform the police system, mandating anti-racism training for officers and implementing more transparent oversight measures. The bill sparked heated debate. Some legislators opposed it, arguing it would undermine police authority. But Sophia remained steadfast. She appeared on television, urging the public to support the bill and sharing Amara's story as evidence of the urgent need for change. With the support of the community and human rights activists, Sophia's police reform bill was passed. It was a victory not just for her family but for countless other victims of injustice. Sophia held a gratitude ceremony at the local community center, inviting those who had stood by her throughout the fight. Amara was invited to speak. Now more mature, she stepped up to the podium with newfound confidence. "Thank you all for standing with my mom and me on this journey. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that hope can overcome any obstacle, no matter how small we may feel. Together, we've proven that injustice cannot prevail when we stand united." After the ceremony, Amara spent time talking with other young people, listening to their stories and sharing her own experiences. She realized her journey had inspired many, and that gave her comfort and encouragement. Meanwhile, Richard, now participating in a rehabilitation program in prison, watched the ceremony on television. He no longer felt anger or tried to justify his actions. Instead, he quietly wrote in his notebook, hoping that one day he could do something meaningful to make amends. Changes in the police system began to take shape. Mandatory anti-racism training programs were rolled out nationwide. Independent oversight committees were established to ensure transparency in internal investigations. Although challenges remained, it was a promising start. Sophia continued her work, tirelessly monitoring and pushing forward the reform process. She participated in international conferences and forums, sharing her experiences and advocating for global cooperation to end injustice based on race. Amara, now a 16-year-old teenager, became more deeply involved in social activism. Alongside her friends from the Anti-Racism Club, she organized discussions at schools and within the community. They encouraged people to share their stories and sought ways to foster understanding among different groups. One day, Amara received a letter from Richard. In it, he wrote, "Amara, I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that your story has changed me. I am trying to become a better person and never want anyone else to go through what you did. Thank you for your strength." Amara read the letter with mixed emotions. She decided not to respond immediately, but deep down, she felt a sense of relief knowing that Richard was trying to make amends. 2 years later, Amara stood on the grand stage of an international human rights conference. Now a confident young woman, she had been invited as the keynote speaker. The auditorium was packed with leaders, activists, and young people from around the world. Amara began her speech. 2 years ago, I felt small and insignificant, but I've come to realize that my voice holds power. Change doesn't begin with those in high positions, it starts with us, the ones who dare to speak the truth and fight for justice. When she finished, the entire audience rose in applause. Sophia, seated among the attendees, couldn't hide her pride. Amara stepped down from the stage and embraced her mother, knowing they had together overcome a journey filled with pain but also profound meaning. That evening, back at home, Amara lit a candle and sat by the window. She reflected on the past, the struggles, Richard, her mother, and those less fortunate than herself. She promised that the light of this candle, like hope, would never fade. "The road ahead is long," she whispered to herself, "but we're moving toward the light."